All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive. Today we're heading straight into the thick of it, the Russia-Ukraine war, and I've got some, well, let's say intriguing updates.
Intriguing is one word for it.
Yeah, we're pulling from a recent CBS News piece. And you've all been following this, so you know this isn't exactly like breaking news.
Right.
But get this, Ukrainian forces actually held a Russian town for a while.
Oh, yeah.
Almost a year, actually. It's crazy, right? It's the first time Russian soil has been held by foreign troops since World War II.
Since World War II, that's a pretty huge statement.
It is, and it kind of throws a wrench in things, to say the least.
To help us unpack all of this, well, we've got our expert in geopolitics and conflict resolution right here.
Glad to be here. Always
Yeah.
happy to try and make sense of this situation.
Yeah, so let's talk about this occupation of Sudza
Sudsaga.
in the Kursk region.
Yeah, it's more than just a symbolic victory for Ukraine. I mean, it's a symbolic victory, don't get me wrong.
Yeah. But it really put some pressure on the Kremlin. Holding that territory, even a small town, it just messes with the narrative that Moscow has been trying to, well, push.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really underscores just how complex this whole conflict is.
Right.
So maybe let's rewind a little just for context.
Okay.
Back to February 24th, 2022, when Russia launched their full-scale invasion.
The day the world changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember, I think it was our second deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
You predicted this wasn't going to be a quick win for Russia.
Yeah.
And, well, you were right, sadly.
Yeah, and it's, over 3 years on now. Things are just more tangled than ever, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's been a real, let's just say, reality check for Russia,
Understatement.
to say the least.
Right.
And the fact that Ukraine managed to occupy Sudza last August, well into the conflict, I mean, that just highlights the struggles Russia's been having.
Yeah, the CBS report I was reading suggests that Russia has been trying to get Sudza back. They've even had some support from, get this, North Korean troops. And it sounds like they've been making some gains, which I got to say kind of makes you wonder why this specific region is so important. Like, what's the big deal with Kursk?
Well, I mean, think about it. Kursk is right on the border. So controlling it, well, that gives Russia a better launching point to, push further into Ukraine.
Right. Makes sense.
But it's not just about strategy. You got to remember, this is where Russia won a huge victory against the Nazis back in World War II.
Oh, right.
So for Putin, it's not just land. It's about pride. It's about history, It all feeds into the story he's trying to tell.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider Putin's recent visit to the troops in Kursk. Like, the guy showed up in full military gear talking about, and I quote here, completely freeing the region from Ukrainian forces.
Wow.
And then you add in his comments about creating a security zone.
Right.
It kind of paints a pretty aggressive picture, you know?
Oh, it definitely does. And it's a pretty stark contrast to, well, there's been another development we need to talk about. You familiar with President Trump's push for a 30-day ceasefire?
Right. I read about that.
Yeah, he even lifted the freeze on U.S. aid to Ukraine and sent his envoy to meet with Russian officials in Moscow.
Wow.
So it's kind of like you've got these totally conflicting things happening at the same time. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. It's like, on the one hand, you've got Putin talking about peace and pushing for this ceasefire.
Right.
And then on the other hand, he's ramping up the military stuff,
Yeah.
visiting troops in a pretty contested area. I mean, what are we supposed to make of that? It's a confusing mix of signals.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, what's Putin really after here? Does he actually want to de-escalate the situation, or is this ceasefire just a way to buy himself some time?
Right.
To regroup, rearm, and then maybe try to grab even more land? That whole security zone thing, that's definitely a red flag for me.
It is for me, too. And, all of this, it makes you wonder, what's next for Ukraine? According to this CBS article, General Syrsky, Ukraine's top military commander, he's admitted that Sudza is basically in ruins after constant Russian airstrikes. And he mentioned moving troops to more advantageous lines, whatever that means. So are they thinking about pulling out of Kursk, like strategically?
It's possible. I mean, they did what they set out to do, right?
Yeah.
They occupied Sudza, put pressure on Russia, but holding on to that territory, it's getting costly. Manpower, resources, the whole 9 yards. So yeah, pulling out, no, that might be a tough decision politically, but from a military perspective, it might be the smartest move.
Yeah, and then there's the whole thing with Major General Krasnolekov, who was in charge of the Kursk operation. He got dismissed. And the CBS article doesn't even say why, which is kind of unsettling.
Yeah, that's definitely a curious detail. It makes you think that maybe there are some disagreements within the Ukrainian military,
Yeah.
you know, about how to move forward. Like maybe some want to keep pushing and others are like, nope, time to get out of Dodge.
So we've got the situation on the ground in Kursk. We've got these mixed messages from both sides. Where do we even go from here? Like, let's talk about this ceasefire and what it could mean for Ukraine. What are the possibilities?
All right, let's dive into that. There are a few scenarios we can look at, and each one comes with its own set of challenges and opportunities. And I think it's important to say up front, the path forward is, well, it's far from clear.
Yeah.
But we can break it down. We can at least try to understand what we're dealing with here.
It's kind of wild to see how this whole thing, it started as like, Russia just trying to grab some land.
Yeah.
And now it's like this huge mess of like, military moves and people trying to talk it out. And then you've got all the like internal power struggles. That's a lot.
It really is. And it just shows you, like in geopolitics, it's never simple. There's always like a million things going on under the surface. Different groups, different goals, hidden agendas, all of it. It's a game, really.
It is. And, then you add in the human element, which like, millions of Ukrainians, they've been displaced,
Yeah.
So many lives lost. And even if they get a ceasefire, the trauma of this, I mean, it's going to last for generations.
Yeah, no doubt. It's heartbreaking. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and all the strategy talk.
Right.
But, there are real people, real families whose lives have been totally like shattered by all of this. It's important to remember that.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about this ceasefire.
Okay.
Like, what are the potential benefits and pitfalls from Ukraine's side? What are they looking at here?
Well, I mean, a ceasefire, that would obviously give everyone a break from the fighting, which is, obviously a good thing. It would give them a chance to get aid to people who need it. And it would also give them a chance to maybe, really sit down and try to talk things out.
Right. But I mean, with Putin's history, can we really trust him to like stick to a ceasefire? And even if he does, wouldn't it just be like a pause, give him time to get ready for round two?
Yeah, those are the big questions, right? You look at how Russia's acted in other conflicts.
Right.
And it's not exactly like a shining example of trustworthiness. They've definitely used ceasefires before, but it's often just been to, regroup and then hit even harder the next time.
Yeah, and that whole security zone thing he keeps talking about.
Right.
It sounds like he wants to just like grab even more of Ukraine, but make it sound like he's just protecting Russia.
Yeah, it's classic.
Yeah.
Create a problem, then offer a solution that benefits you. The question is, will other countries see through it?
Right. It feels like the whole world is like walking on eggshells right now. They want to help Ukraine. They want to stop Russia, but they're also, terrified of making things worse, like starting a bigger war.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, with the whole nuclear thing, it's a huge risk. No one wants to be the one to push that button.
So with all this uncertainty, like, what are the most likely scenarios here? Can they even negotiate something, or are we stuck with this forever war?
It's really hard to say, But there are some things we can look at. Like, first, will Russia even agree to a real ceasefire? And will they actually stick to it?
Right.
Second, what's Ukraine going to do about holding that land in Russia? They're taking losses, and Russia could attack again any minute. And then, what are other countries going to do? Are they going to keep supporting Ukraine? Are they going to start pushing for a deal, even if it means Ukraine has to give something up? It's all connected. What happens inside Russia, inside Ukraine, and what other countries do, it's all going to affect what happens next. It's like trying to predict, I don't know, like a hurricane. You can kind of see the general path, but there's always going to be surprises, twists and turns you don't expect.
Let's shift gears for a second.
Okay.
We talked about the potential for this to, spread beyond Ukraine. You mentioned North Korea helping Russia in Kursk. That's a little scary, Are there other signs we should be watching for, like things that might mean a bigger war is coming?
It's not a pleasant thought, but, we can't ignore it. There are a few things that could trigger a wider conflict. One, like you said, is other countries getting more directly involved. Like if they start sending troops or weapons, that could be a big problem.
And then there's, the whole cyber warfare thing. I mean, we've already seen Russia accused of, attacking Ukraine and other countries online. What if they launched a huge attack? like against a power grid or something? Could that start a real war?
Cyber warfare it's a whole other beast. It's so hard to predict how it could escalate. But yeah, a major attack, especially if it hurt a lot of civilians or really messed up a country's economy,
Hmm.
that could definitely be seen as an act of war. And then, it could trigger a military response, and then it's off to the races, basically.
It feels like we're like walking on a tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to help Ukraine without, accidentally starting World War III.
It's a tough situation, and that's the challenge for, the people making decisions. They have to find a way to stop Russia without pushing Putin so hard that he just, snaps.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the ceasefire, the chances of things getting worse, and how, the whole world is trying to figure out what to do. But I want to like circle back to the people in Ukraine. I mean, they've been living with this for over 3 years. I can't even imagine what that's like.
It's, the human cost of this whole thing, it's immense. Millions of people have lost their homes, their livelihoods, their sense of security. It's going to take years, maybe decades, for them to heal from this, even if the fighting stops tomorrow.
And I mean, the economic damage, that's got to be huge too. Rebuilding all that infrastructure, getting businesses back up and running, it's a monumental task.
Yeah, it's going to take a huge coordinated effort. The Ukrainian government, other countries, everyone's going to have to pitch in to get Ukraine back on its feet. And even then, it's going to be a long, difficult road.
So it's important to remember, while we're talking about all this strategy and stuff, that there are real people at the heart of this. It's not just some, abstract geopolitical game. These are decisions that are affecting people's lives in a very real, very painful way.
Exactly. And when we talk about peace and security, it shouldn't just be about borders and national interests. It should be about protecting people, making sure they can live in dignity and safety. That's what really matters.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. But I think it's safe to say the situation in Ukraine is still very much up in the air. There are no easy answers.
Yeah, that's the truth.
What are your final thoughts as we, wrap up this part of our deep dive?
I think the big takeaway is that this is far from over, and the road ahead it's dangerous.
Yeah.
But even with all the chaos, there's still hope.
Yeah.
The Ukrainian people, they've shown incredible strength and resilience, and most of the world has come together to stand against Russia. That's something.
That's true. So even with all the challenges, there's still a chance, a chance for diplomacy to work, for real peace. But it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of compromise, and a real commitment to building a just and lasting peace. Not just, stopping the fighting. We've talked about, the military side of things, the diplomatic efforts, and the human cost of this whole war. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier. This could spread beyond Ukraine. That's a pretty scary thought. You've been studying these kinds of conflicts for years. Like, what are the specific things we should be watching for that might mean, a bigger war is coming?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The potential for this to escalate, it's definitely there. And while nobody wants a bigger war, understanding what could trigger it, it helps us look at everything a bit more clearly. I mean, one clear trigger would be if Russia directly attacked a NATO country. Article 5 of the NATO that's the whole foundation of the alliance. It says that if one member is attacked, it's considered an attack on all of them. So if Russia, let's say, targeted Poland or Romania, that would almost certainly trigger a response from all of NATO.
And that could mean, an all-out war between Russia and the West, which is, I mean, terrifying, especially
Sure.
when you consider both sides have, nuclear weapons. The consequences of that, it's almost too much to think about. But what about situations where, like, there's no direct attack on a NATO country? Could this, with more countries getting involved, like we've seen with North Korea supporting Russia in Kursk, could that lead to a wider conflict?
Absolutely. The more players you have in the game, the less predictable it becomes. The risk of a miscalculation, of something happening that nobody intended that could pull even more countries in, it just goes up. Imagine if, say, China decided to give Russia a lot of military help. I mean, that would completely change the balance of power and could force the West to, really rethink their whole approach.
And then, of course, there's cyber warfare. We've already seen Russia accused of launching cyber attacks, against Ukraine and its allies. Could that play a role in making this conflict even bigger? Like, what if they launched a huge cyber attack on, say, a power grid or a financial system? Could that be the thing that pushes it over the edge?
Cyber warfare is It's kind of like the Wild West out there. It's so hard to predict how it could escalate. But yeah, if there was a major cyber attack that crippled a country's infrastructure or, God forbid, killed a lot of people, it could easily be seen as an act of war. And that could lead to a really strong military response, maybe even one that's out of proportion to the original attack.
So it sounds like, we're walking a very fine line here, trying to support Ukraine and stop Russia without, accidentally starting a much bigger war that could have just unimaginable consequences.
It's a high-stakes game, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The people making these decisions, they're trying to find that perfect balance, that sweet spot where they can deter Putin, but not push him so hard that he feels like he has nothing left to lose. It's a very delicate situation.
So given all of this, all the things we've talked about, all the complexity, all the uncertainty, what do you think is going to happen in the next few months? Is a ceasefire even possible, or are we headed for a long, drawn-out war with no end in sight?
If I had a crystal ball, I'd tell you. But the truth is, nobody knows for sure. But I do think the next few months will be really important. There are some key things to watch. First, will Russia agree to a real ceasefire, one that actually means something? And if they do, will they keep their word? Their history, as we've discussed, isn't exactly encouraging on that front. We also need to see how Ukraine reacts to all the pressure they're facing. Holding that territory inside Russia, that's risky. Will they pull back or will they dig in, even though it could make things worse? And finally, we got to look at what other countries are doing. Will they keep supporting Ukraine? Or will they start pushing for a deal, even if it means Ukraine has to give up something? All of these things, what happens inside Russia, inside Ukraine, and what the rest of the world does, it's all going to affect what happens next.
So there's a lot to keep an eye on, a lot of moving pieces.
There are. And it's a situation that deserves our attention. We need to stay informed, to question the stories we're being told, and to keep having these kinds of discussions.
Well, you've certainly given us and our listeners a lot to think about. This has been a really insightful, deep dive into, a conflict that's both complicated and constantly changing. Thanks for sharing your expertise and helping us make sense of it all.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
We hope this deep dive has helped you understand the situation in Ukraine a little better. It's a conflict with, huge implications for the whole world. Staying informed is so important. We'll keep following what's happening and bring you more insights as things develop. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay engaged with the world around you.